Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back in time. Way back. Close your eyes for a moment, or just let your gaze soften as you listen, and imagine the crackle of a fire in a massive stone hall, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and, well, probably unwashed bodies if we're being honest. You're in a castle, somewhere in medieval Europe around the start of the 14th century. Life is tough, brutish and short for most people, sure. But up here, behind these thick walls, life isn't necessarily easy. It's just different, more complicated, more dangerous in unexpected ways. Because tonight, we're diving headfirst into a world of crowns and controversies. A realm where power plays were deadly serious and royal indiscretions could shake kingdoms to their very foundations. You might think your office politics are bad, but trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a week in a medieval court. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always cool to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you find yourself standing in the shadows of the early 14th century. It's a time when kings ruled, or at least thought they ruled by divine right. God put them there, end of story. Except it wasn't the end of the story at all, was it? Not when you had powerful nobles who controlled vast lands and private armies. A church whose influence could make or break a monarch and international politics that were less about treaties and more about who was marrying whose cousin, or perhaps more importantly, who owed whom money. Think of it like a really high-stakes, poorly lit game of chess. But the pieces sometimes literally tried to kill each other when they weren't on the board. The weight of a crown in this era wasn't just about looking good for portraits, though they probably didn't care much about that. Anyway, have you seen some medieval depictions? It was about balancing competing interests, managing expectations, and projecting an image of strength and piety, whether you actually possess those qualities or not. You're navigating this landscape where honor is everything, but loyalty is often conditional. Where a king's word is law, unless enough powerful people decide it isn't. It's a powder keg, really waiting for a spark. And the sparks in this period, oh, they were plentiful. Sometimes they came from within the royal family itself, sometimes from unexpected friendships, and sometimes from the highest echelons of power, clashing with powerful, secretive organizations. We're talking about the kind of drama that makes reality TV look like a quiet Sunday afternoon knitting circle. Except with actual life or death consequences and a lot less structured hair. Consider the king. He's expected to be a warrior, a leader, a fount of justice, and ideally produce male heirs without causing too much fuss. It's a demanding job description, even without modern social media judging your every move. Imagine the pressure. And sometimes that pressure combined with personal desires or failings leads to, well, let's just say unconventional choices. Choices that ripple outwards, causing shock waves that historians are still trying to fully understand centuries later. For example, it's a mainstream historical fact that kings in this period often traveled extensively throughout their kingdoms, holding court wherever they went, partly to show themselves to their people, and partly because large retinues were expensive to feed in one place for too long. This wasn't just sitting on a fancy chair. It was a constant performance of kingship. And within these constantly moving, often drafty courts, friendships formed. Some were politically savvy alliances, others perhaps genuine affection. But when a king elevates someone outside the traditional power structure, someone who wasn't born into the top tier of nobility, that's when eyebrows start to rise, and daggers both metaphorical and literal might start appearing. You can almost hear the whispers echoing down those long stone corridors, can't you? The rustle of heavy fabrics, the clinking of spurs, and the low murmur of discontent. It's the soundtrack to the political instability brewing just beneath the surface of courtly life. And you're right there feeling the tension in the air, perhaps adjusting your own slightly too scratchy wool tunic. It makes you wonder what kind of bizarre little habits or beliefs were common among the folks scurrying around these castles. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people, including royalty, apparently had some pretty wild ideas about medicine and hygiene. Some remedies involved things like ground up precious stones, or believe it or not dried crocodile dung used as a kind of sunscreen or skin treatment. Seriously. Imagine that being part of your daily beauty routine. Oh, just popping out, darling, gotta apply my sunblock. Utterly bonkers, but a reminder of how alien their world could be. The decisions made in these moments of tension weren't always clear-cut. They were often born of desperation, ambition, or perhaps a genuine belief in the rightness of one's actions, however questionable they might seem to us. Historians still argue whether many of these figures were truly evil villains, hapless victims of circumstance, or just products of a brutal and unforgiving political system. Were their actions driven by malice, weakness, or simply the prevailing cutthroat norms of the time? It's a debate without a simple answer, which is part of what makes these stories so compelling. It's like trying to understand why someone would willingly apply crocodile dung to their face. The reasoning is lost to time and different cultural norms. So as we settle into this world, forget the shining armor and damsels in distress for a moment. We're dealing with the gritty reality of power, loyalty, betrayal, and the messy, scandalous lives of the people who sat at the very top of the medieval pyramid. Prepare yourself for favorites who flew too close to the sun queens who became rebels, and a powerful religious order that vanished almost overnight. It's a bumpy ride, and you've just taken your first step onto the uneven cobblestones of the 14th century. You've arrived just as a new century is dawning a time of transition, and nowhere is that clearer than in England. The throne is occupied by Edward III, a king so formidable they called him Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots. He was everything a medieval monarch was supposed to be: tall, commanding, a fierce warrior, a capable administrator, and utterly determined to assert his authority. He had big boots to fill, both literally and figuratively, and he expected his heir, young Edward, to step neatly into them. But history, as it often does, had other plans. Prince Edward wasn't quite his father's son. Where Edward the Wise was rugged and martial, young Edward was said to be more interested in things like manual crafts, ditch digging, thatching roofs, maybe even a spot of gardening, rather than the brutal sport of jousting or the grim business of war. Imagine the parental disappointment. It would be like finding out your sports star kid just wants to knit cozy sweaters. It wasn't necessarily bad, just unexpected, unprincely. Into this rather awkward princely existence stepped a figure who would change everything: Piers Gaveston. Piers was a Gascon from the region in France that the English kings controlled. His father was a knight in Edward I's service, and Piers himself was brought into the royal household around 1300 or 1301, intended to be a companion for the prince. and a companion he became, and then some. You see Piers maybe around the same age as the prince, perhaps a little older, entering the echoing halls of the English court. He's everything the prince isn't: dashing, witty, charming, excellent at tourneys, and possessed of a confidence that borders on arrogance. He's got that certain je ne sais quoi, or perhaps just plain cojones. The connection was immediate and intense. The prince and Piers became inseparable. They shared everything, spent all their time together, and young Edward seemed utterly captivated by Gaveston. This wasn't just a casual friendship. It was a bond that contemporaries described in terms that suggested a profound emotional and perhaps physical intimacy. The chroniclers of the time often used words like brotherhood, or highlighted the king's immoderate affection, which in the language of the day could be code for something more, or could simply reflect the shock at the sheer intensity and exclusiveness of the relationship, regardless of its exact nature. You can almost feel the buzz in the court, the raised eyebrows, the hushed conversations behind tapestry-draped walls. This closeness, this elevation of a Gascon knight over the native English nobility, did not sit well with Edward I. The old king understood power and precedent. He knew that a king needed the support of his barons, the great lords of the realm, who held the reins of power outside of London. Showing such blatant favoritism to one man, especially one of relatively minor foreign stock, was politically unwise, even dangerous. It undermined the natural order of the court and alienated the very people the prince would one day need to rely upon. Edward I tried to separate them, sending Gaveston away more than once. But the moment Piers was gone, Prince Edward would mope and petition until his father relented and allowed Gaveston's return. It was a cycle of banishment and recall that offered a preview of the problems to come. Imagine trying to explain to a stern medieval warrior king that his son is having friendship issues and needs his bestie back. Probably didn't go over well. The disapproval wasn't just from the king. The English magnates watched this unfolding drama with growing alarm. They saw Gaveston as an upstart, someone whispering in the prince's ear, potentially gaining undue influence. In a society built on hierarchy and lineage, Piers Gaveston was a disruptive element, a foreigner who hadn't earned his place through traditional means, but through the king's personal affection. This was the core of the scandal surrounding their relationship, the perceived impropriety of the favoritism and its potential impact on governance more than necessarily a judgment on the specific nature of their private lives by everyone involved, although certainly some found that scandalous too. A mainstream historical fact is that Edward I, shortly before his death in 1307, specifically banished Piers Gaveston, again extracting a promise from his son and other nobles that Gaveston would not be allowed to return. This shows just how serious the old king viewed the situation. It was one of his final acts. Yet the moment Edward I drew his last breath, his son, now Edward II, completely disregarded this command. It's like your parent tells you not to get a tattoo, and the second you turn 18, you're at the nearest parlor getting a full sleeve. Except instead of a tattoo, it was the immediate recall and elevation of the person your dying father explicitly warned you against. Talk about filial piety. Historians still argue whether the primary source of the controversy surrounding Edward II and Piers Gaveston was the precise nature of their personal relationship, or simply the outrageous degree of political favoritism Edward showed to a relative newcomer, regardless of that relationship's specifics. Was the scandal about love or about power, or most likely a complicated, messy mix of both? You see, even centuries later, trying to untangle medieval motives is like trying to find a specific flea on a very large, very dirty sheep. You can see the storm clouds gathering. The stage is set for conflict between a king determined to elevate his favorite and the powerful lords determined to keep him in his place. This deep, perhaps obsessive bond between Edward II and Piers Gaveston wasn't just a personal matter. It was a political crisis waiting to explode. And explode it would. So the Hammer of the Scots breathes his last, and young Edward is finally king. And what does he do? The absolute first thing, practically before the funeral-baked meats were cold, is recall Piers Gaveston. Remember how his formidable dad explicitly forbade it. Yeah, Edward II pretty much ripped up that particular deathbed promise on day one. Gaveston, who had been sent away to Ireland, is back in England, faster than you can say royal favoritism gone wild. And not only is he back, but the new king immediately starts showering him with honors and wealth on an unprecedented scale. You watch perhaps from a discreet distance in the crowded court as Piers steps off the boat and walks right back into the king's inner circle, radiating an air of triumph that must have been absolutely infuriating to the old guard. Within months of Edward II's accession in 1307, Piers Gaveston, a man of relatively minor noble birth, is granted the earldom of Cornwall. Now, this wasn't just any old earldom. Cornwall was incredibly rich, yielding vast revenues, and it was traditionally held by members of the royal family. Giving it to Gaveston was like giving your best friend the keys to the family yacht and the company credit card on your first day as CEO, completely bypassing all the senior executives who've been with the company for decades. It was a blatant power move, a clear signal that the king's favorite was now one of the most powerful men in the realm, courtesy of the king's almost limitless generosity. You see the other earls exchange glances, stern, flinty glances that promise trouble. But it wasn't just the titles and the money that irked the barons, although that was certainly a huge part of it. It was Gaveston's attitude. Piers was witty, charming, skilled in combat, and clearly felt superior to the stuffy, old-fashioned English lords. And he wasn't shy about showing it. He paraded his wealth, outshone the nobles, at tournaments where he was reportedly excellent and generally acted as if he ran the place. He was arrogant, dismissive, and seemed to delight in provoking the powerful men who resented him. Think of that co-worker who got promoted way too fast and now swans around the office like they own it, making snide comments about everyone else. Now imagine that co-worker is also sleeping in the boss's office, and the boss is the king. Piers wasn't content with just outshining them. He also decided to make fun of them, and not just gentle ribbing. Gaveston came up with cruel, mocking nicknames for the leading barons' titles that highlighted their physical flaws or personality quirks in the most unflattering way possible. He called Guy de Beauchamp the powerful Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog of Artois, a reference to his stern appearance and quick temper. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, who was the king's cousin and the wealthiest man in England, after the king himself was dubbed the play actor, or the churl. Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, an older respected statesman, was reportedly called Burst Belly due to his corpulence, or maybe Old Toby. And Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, was derisively called Joseph the Jew, likely a slight against his pale complexion, or perhaps a jab at perceived stinginess playing on anti-Semitic stereotypes of the time. These weren't funny jokes shared amongst friends. These were public insults delivered by the man closest to the king, the one who controlled access and influence. Imagine being one of the most powerful lords in the kingdom, a man whose family had served the crown for generations, only to be publicly ridiculed by some Gascon upstart the king picked up. It was an unbearable affront to their honor and status. It was like getting ratioed on medieval Twitter. But the consequences were much, much worse than losing followers. A mainstream historical fact is that Piers Gaveston was indeed given the earldom of Cornwall almost immediately after Edward II's coronation, a move that caused instant fury among the English nobility. This wasn't a slow burn. The resentment was immediate and intense. It solidified their opposition to Gaveston and increasingly to the king who so blindly supported him. The barons weren't just annoyed. They were starting to coalesce into a powerful opposition group. Led by figures like Thomas of Lancaster, Aymer de Valence, and Guy de Beauchamp, they began demanding reforms and, crucially, the permanent removal of Gaveston. They felt sidelined and disrespected. Their traditional role as advisors to the king was being usurped by this one man. It threatened their power, their prestige, and the stability of the kingdom as they saw it. You can almost hear the low growl building among them like distant thunder. It makes you wonder about the small, personal details of their lives that we rarely hear about. For example, a quirky tidbit: while the nobility were dealing with this political drama, everyday life continued with its own challenges. For instance, toothache was a major problem, and some medieval cures involved things like wearing a pouch of worm's teeth around your neck. So, while the earls were fuming about Gaveston's nicknames, they might also have been sporting a worm teeth necklace to ward off dental pain. A truly bizarre, multitasking scenario. Historians still argue whether Piers Gaveston was a genuinely malicious figure actively seeking to undermine the English nobility, or simply a charismatic but foolish young man who didn't understand the rigid power structures of the English court and overplayed his hand spectacularly. Was his behavior calculated cruelty or merely arrogant ignorance? It's a question of intent that's hard to definitively answer when you only have fragmented accounts written by people who often hated him. The scene is set. The king has his favorite. The favorite has insulted the most powerful men in the kingdom, and those men are now united in their determination to see Gaveston gone. The stage is littered with ruffled feathers, bruised egos, and the distinct smell of impending conflict. The era of peace and cooperation that Edward Boy might have envisioned for his son's reign is already looking like a distant dream. So you've got the king utterly devoted to his favorite, who in turn is openly contemptuous of the most powerful men in the kingdom. The air in the great halls is thick with unspoken threats and barely concealed fury. The barons, led by the formidable Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, and a man with a serious chip on his shoulder, possibly related to that play actor nickname, decide they've had enough. They present the king with a united front, a list of grievances that all boil down to one central demand: Piers Gaveston must go, and this time for good. These weren't requests. They were demands backed by the collective might of men who could raise armies that rivaled the king's own. The barons essentially told Edward II, either he goes, or things are going to get very, very uncomfortable for you. Their leverage was simple, but effective. They controlled the resources, the manpower, and the political will needed to govern the kingdom, and crucially, to fund and fight the ongoing wars, particularly against the Scots. Without their cooperation, the king was essentially powerless outside of his immediate household. It was a stark reminder that medieval kingship, despite the divine right claims, was a constant negotiation with the powerful elite. Edward II, who seemed to possess his father's stubbornness, but none of his father's political acumen, initially resisted. He tried to protect Piers, to find a way around the baron's demands. You can imagine the scene-heated arguments behind closed doors, the king pleading, or perhaps even throwing a royal tantrum, while the stern faces of the earls remained unmoved. They had him cornered. Eventually, under immense pressure, Edward capitulated. He agreed to banish Piers Gaveston once more. A mainstream historical fact is that in 1308, just months after Edward II's coronation, the barons forced him to agree to Gaveston's exile. This wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a political ultimatum delivered at a parliament. Gaveston was compelled to swear an oath never to return without the consent of the barons. He was initially sent to Flanders, then quickly moved to Ireland, where Edward appointed him king's lieutenant. This sounds like a demotion, but it was also a position of authority and revenue away for Edward to keep Piers in a position of power and comfort, even in exile. It was exile light, if you will. More like a forced, very luxurious vacation to the medieval equivalent of witness protection. But even with Piers across the sea, Edward II was miserable. He missed his friend desperately. The political necessity of banishing Gaveston didn't change the depth of the king's attachment. So almost immediately after Piers departed, Edward began plotting how to get him back. He wasn't interested in ruling without his favorite companion and advisor, if you could call Gaveston an advisor. Provocateur might be more accurate. This is where the political maneuvering gets intricate, like trying to untangle a ball of medieval yarn that's been attacked by a particularly enthusiastic cat. Edward started working behind the scenes, trying to exploit divisions among the barons, making promises, and crucially seeking support from outside England. He appealed to the Pope Clement V, who was heavily influenced by the French king Philip IV. Isabella's, "Dad, remember him. We'll get back to him later." The king argued that the oath forcing Gaveston's exile was illegal and taken under duress, asking the Pope to annul it. Papal intervention in secular politics was common, but this was a stretch even for the Pope. It's like asking the Pope to weigh in on your office seating chart drama because you don't like where your boss put your friend. Meanwhile, Gaveston in Ireland wasn't exactly living a life of penance. As lieutenant, he wielded significant power, governing the island in the king's name, raising troops, and enjoying the revenues of the office. You can picture him there, perhaps pacing the battlements of a castle in Dublin, plotting his return, while Edward back in England pulled every string he could find. It was less, "Woe is me, I'm in exile," and more, "Phase 1 of my glorious return is complete." It makes you wonder about the more mundane aspects of life in medieval Ireland at that time. For instance, a quirky tidbit: while Gaveston was busy being lieutenant, the Irish populace had their own distinct culture and legal system, often at odds with the English administration. They had fascinating traditions, including intricate knotwork art and music played on harps. So perhaps, while Gaveston was plotting in his castle, he might have occasionally heard the sounds of Irish harp music, drifting in a strange backdrop to his political machinations. A truly surreal juxtaposition. Historians still argue whether the barons genuinely believed that Gaveston was a threat to the stability of the kingdom itself, or if their primary motivation was simply the personal insult and loss of influence they suffered due to the king's blatant favoritism. Was it principled opposition, or just petty jealousy, writ large across the political landscape? It's tough to say definitively, as their rhetoric certainly emphasized the common good, but their personal animosity towards Piers was undeniable. Edward's efforts, combined with some clever legal footwork and possibly some strategically placed bribes, began to bear fruit. Some of the barons, perhaps tiring of the conflict or swayed by the king's promises, started to waver in their opposition. The united front against Gaveston wasn't quite as united as it seemed, and Edward, sensing the shift, pressed his advantage. He was determined to have Piers back at his side no matter the cost, no matter the oath he had sworn. The stage was being set for Gaveston's triumphant and ultimately disastrous return. The quiet, tense waiting is almost over. Despite the solemn oaths sworn and the very real political pressure, Edward II simply couldn't bear to be without Piers Gaveston. While Piers was governing, and presumably enjoying himself, in Ireland, Edward back home was pulling strings, begging the Pope, and generally making a nuisance of himself to anyone who might help. And help arrived. Or perhaps Edward just forced the issue. Through a combination of the Pope's questionable absolution from the oath, Piers had sworn some strategic politicking by Edward, and perhaps just the sheer will of the King Piers, Gaveston returned to England in 1309. Imagine the scene. You're a baron, one of the powerful lords who forced the king to banish his favorite just a year or so ago. You probably thought, okay, that's sorted. Now we can get on with running the country. And then you hear the news. Gaveston is back. Not sneaking back in disguise, but returning openly, probably with a swagger that could curdle milk. It must have felt like a slap in the face, a complete disregard for their authority and the promises the king had made. Edward II, delighted to have his friend back, acted as if nothing had happened. He restored Piers to his former position, showered him with even more gifts, and resumed their close companionship. It was a spectacular display of tone deafness by the king, or perhaps just a deliberate provocation. And Gaveston. He didn't exactly return with humility and a newfound respect for the English peerage. Oh no. He came back seemingly more arrogant, more ostentatious, and just as contemptuous of the barons as before. He resumed his prominent place at court, controlled access to the king, and probably went right back to calling the earls insulting names behind their backs, or maybe even to their faces. It was defiance personified. You can almost see the steam rising from the barons' ears, the veins throbbing in their temples. Seriously, he's back, and he's still like this. It would test the patience of a saint, let alone a medieval baron with an army. This wasn't just annoying. It was deeply destabilizing. The barons saw that Edward II was incapable or unwilling to rule according to convention, to listen to his natural counselors, and to prioritize the good of the kingdom as they defined it, of course, over his personal attachments. They realized that simply banishing Gaveston wasn't enough. They needed to fundamentally change how the kingdom was governed and how the king's power was exercised. This led to a pivotal moment in English constitutional history. A mainstream historical fact is that in response to Gaveston's return and Edward II's continued misrule, a group of barons and bishops was appointed in 1310, known as the Lords Ordainers. Their task was to draw up a set of reforms to regulate the king's household and the administration of the realm. These reforms were eventually issued as the Ordinances of 1311. This wasn't just about peers anymore. It was about controlling the monarchy itself. It was an attempt to impose aristocratic control over royal government, a significant challenge to the concept of unfettered royal power. The ordinances were extensive and radical. They demanded, among other things, the permanent banishment of Piers Gaveston, prohibiting his return under pain of death. They also required that the king consult the barons on important matters, that key royal officials, like the treasurer and chancellor, be appointed with baronial consent, and that customs revenues, a major source of royal income, be controlled by the exchequer, not the king's favorites. It was essentially a blueprint for limiting the king's arbitrary power, trying to force him into a constitutional box. Imagine telling the CEO they need board approval for everything, and also they have to fire their best friend. They were asking the king to fundamentally change how he operated. You can picture the scene, the ordainers meeting in smoky rooms, drafting these weighty documents, their faces grim with determination. The scratching of their quills sounds like tiny battles being fought on parchment. They are creating a framework designed to constrain a monarch who seemed determined to ignore tradition and counsel. They were trying to restore order as they saw it to a court spiraling out of control. It makes you consider the little details of medieval life that were happening concurrently. A quirky tidbit: while these high-stakes political dramas were unfolding, things like public entertainment were still a part of life. Traveling minstrels and performers would go from town to town, entertaining crowds with music, juggling, and storytelling. So in the background of this intense political crisis, ordinary people might have been enjoying a performance by a juggler who was actually good at their job, unlike certain royal favorites managing the kingdom's affairs. Historians still argue whether the ordinances of 1311 represented a genuine desire for good governance and constitutional reform, or if they were primarily a tool for the barons to consolidate their own power and remove rivals like Gaveston. Were the ordainers patriots or self-serving oligarchs? The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the messy middle, a blend of genuine grievances and personal ambition. Edward II hated the ordinances. He resented being told what to do, especially when it involved banishing peers yet again. He ratified them under duress, knowing full well he intended to circumvent them the first chance he got. The stage was now set for a direct confrontation. The barons had issued their demands backed by law, or at least the law they had created. The king had his favorite back, and his resentment was simmering. This fragile, tense peace wouldn't last. The return of Gaveston was the spark that lit the fuse on a much larger conflict. So Gaveston is back, strutting around court like he owns the place, and the barons are incandescent with rage. Remember those stern faces and the rustling of parchments from the last section? That was them getting serious. They'd tried banishment, and the king just ignored it. This time, they weren't just asking for peers to leave. They were demanding a complete overhaul of the government, and they were writing it all down in a document designed to tie the king's hands. This was the genesis of the Ordinances of 1311. The Lords Ordainers, a committee of 21 individuals appointed by the Parliament of 1310, a mainstream historical fact. The establishment of this powerful baronial committee was a formal constitutional challenge. Were tasked with reforming the kingdom and the king. These weren't just random gripes. They were formal articles of governance that aimed to curtail the king's personal power and ensure he ruled with the consent and counsel of his leading nobles. You can imagine them debating every clause, trying to foresee every loophole the king might exploit, perhaps fueled by lukewarm ale and a shared dislike of Gascon upstarts. The ordinances covered a wide range of issues, from financial controls to how officials were appointed. But the beating heart of the document, the thing that everyone knew was the real catalyst, was Piers Gaveston. The ordinances were absolutely unequivocal. Piers Gaveston was to be permanently banished from England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and all other lands under the king's dominion. Not just a timeout in Ireland this time. He was to go and never ever come back. And just to make the point crystal clear, the penalty for his return was specified death. It was essentially a legal hit warrant approved by the leading men of the kingdom. Talk about a performance review. Other key provisions aimed to dismantle the king's ability to rule arbitrarily. The king was required to get baronial consent for going to war, leaving the kingdom, appointing key ministers, and even granting lands or revenues. His household spending was to be curbed, and customs duties were to be controlled by the exchequer for the good of the realm, not treated as the king's personal piggy bank. It was a comprehensive attempt to make the king accountable to his magnates, a move that echoed earlier struggles between the crown and the nobility, like the events surrounding Magna Carta, but with a specific focus on the perceived abuses of Edward II's personal rule. You can feel the tension in the great hall where the ordinances were formally presented. The air is thick and heavy, the stone walls seeming to absorb the collective anxiety. Edward II is there, surrounded by the stern faces of the ordainers and the assembled lords. He knows he has to accept them. He doesn't have the power, the support, or perhaps even the will at that moment to defy such a united front. So he agrees. He formally accepts the ordinances, giving them the force of law. You might think, great problem solved. Everyone lives happily ever after. But this is medieval history, remember? That's not how it works. Edward II had no intention of abiding by the ordinances, particularly the part about Piers. He had agreed under duress, and as soon as the immediate pressure was off, he began looking for ways to circumvent them. This isn't just speculation. His actions immediately after confirm it. He kept Gaveston by his side, ignored the requirements for baronial consent, and continued to rule as he pleased, or rather, as Piers pleased. It was a game of cat and mouse with the barons, as the increasingly frustrated cats, and Edward and Piers as the infuriatingly slippery mice. The barons, having gone through the effort of drawing up these detailed reforms and forcing the king's consent, were not about to stand idly by while he ignored them. Their patience had worn thin years ago. Now their demands were legal requirements, and the most prominent one was Gaveston's exile. When Edward failed to send Piers away again, the leading barons decided to take matters into their own hands. This wasn't just about political theory anymore. It was about enforcement. And enforcement in the 14th century often involved gathering armed men. It makes you wonder about the more mundane practicalities for the ordainers during this intense period. For instance, a quirky tidbit. Medieval documents, especially long important ones like the ordinances, were written by scribes using quills and ink, a painstaking process. The ink was often made from things like oak galls, small growths on oak trees mixed with iron sulfate. So the document that sealed Gaveston's fate and attempted to rein in a king was literally written with ink derived from trees and iron, a very earthy contrast to the high-flying political drama. Historians still argue whether the ordinances of 1311 were a genuinely feasible program for governance that could have established a more limited constitutional monarchy, or if they were so restrictive and self-serving to the baronial faction that they were practically unenforceable from the start. Were the ordainers pushing for progress or just their own power? It's a classic chicken and egg problem in historical analysis. The acceptance of the ordinances was not the end of the conflict. It was merely the legal basis for the next phase. The barons now had formal justification for their opposition to Edward II and his beloved favorite. They had laid down the law, and when the king broke it by keeping Gaveston, they were prepared to use force to uphold it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would have deadly consequences for Piers Gaveston. The ticking clock is getting louder now. Edward II, bless his oblivious heart, really thought he could just ignore the ordinances. He kept Piers by his side, went on, as if the detailed list of restrictions and demands accepted under oath didn't apply to him. He seemed genuinely surprised when the barons, having gone to all that trouble with the lords ordainers and the formal documents written in ink from trees, decided they weren't kidding. Their patience stretched thinner than medieval parchment finally snapped. The mandate of the ordinances was clear: Gaveston must go or else. And Edward's failure to comply triggered the or else. The leading barons, particularly the core group who had been most vocal against Gaveston, Lancaster Warwick, the Black Dog, Pembroke, Joseph the Jew, and others, decided that if the king wouldn't enforce the law, the ordinances, they would. They gathered their forces, essentially raising a baronial army with the specific goal of apprehending Piers Gaveston and enforcing the permanent banishment clause of the ordinances, which conveniently for them carried the death penalty for return. This wasn't just a protest. It was an armed uprising aimed directly at the king's favorite. Edward and Piers, suddenly realizing the barons were very, very serious this time, were forced to flee. They raced north, desperately trying to find a safe haven away from the pursuing baronial forces. They eventually reached Scarborough Castle on the coast of Yorkshire. It was a strong fortress perched dramatically on a rocky headland overlooking the North Sea. Edward made a fateful decision. There he left Piers in the castle, provisioned for a siege, while he himself rode further south, perhaps hoping to rally support or distract the barons. Leaving your best friend in a castle under siege while you ride off. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of your strategic genius, Edward. So you find yourself with Piers Gaveston inside the cold, damp walls of Scarborough Castle. You can hear the roar of the sea outside and the distant sounds of the baronial army setting up camp below. The siege began. Gaveston held out for a while, but the castle wasn't adequately provisioned for a long siege, and relief from the king wasn't forthcoming. Seeing the writing on the wall, probably literally written on the cold stone by bored soldiers, Piers entered into negotiations with the besieging barons, specifically with Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, the man Gaveston had cruelly nicknamed Joseph the Jew. A mainstream historical fact is that Piers Gaveston surrendered Scarborough Castle to the Earl of Pembroke in May 1312. Pembroke, known for being a relatively more moderate figure compared to some of the others, gave Gaveston a solemn promise of safe conduct. The agreement was that Piers would be held in custody but under Pembroke's protection until he could be brought before a full parliament to face the charges against him. This seemed for a brief moment like a civilized legal resolution to the crisis. But remember who else was involved? The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog. A man who hated Gaveston with a burning intensity, arguably greater than any other baron. While Pembroke was escorting Gaveston south, temporarily leaving him at a manor house near Warwick, the Black Dog saw his chance. This is where the story takes a dark turn. While Pembroke was away, Warwick, along with the Earl of Lancaster and others, arrived and seized Gaveston, completely disregarding Pembroke's safe conduct. Imagine the audacity. It's like promising someone they'll get a fair trial and then letting their worst enemy kidnap them on the way to the courthouse. Gaveston was taken to Warwick Castle, where he was reportedly treated with contempt. The barons held a hasty council. There was no trial, no chance for defense, despite Pembroke's promise. The ordinances declared Piers an outlaw subject to the death penalty upon return. The barons, led by the unforgiving Warwick and Lancaster, decided that was justification enough. They hauled Piers Gaveston out of Warwick Castle and took him to a place called Blacklow Hill, just outside Warwick. On Blacklow Hill, on June 19, 1312, the final act of Piers Gaveston's dramatic life played out. You stand there on the grassy hill, the wind perhaps whipping around you. The grim faces of the barons surround Gaveston. There's no fanfare, no last-minute reprieve. They didn't even give him a proper execution on a scaffold. A couple of Welshmen in their service carried out the sentence. Piers Gaveston was speared or stabbed to death. It was a brutal summary execution, carried out without legal process, beyond the baron's interpretation of the ordinances. His body was left there initially, a stark message to the king and anyone else who defied the baronial will. It makes you ponder the small personal details lost to time. A quirky tidbit, Piers Gaveston was known for his fashionable clothing and extravagant lifestyle, a contrast to the often more austere English lords. He might have been wearing some ridiculously expensive, colorful outfit when he was captured and killed, adding a bizarre visual contrast to the grim scene on Blacklow Hill. Imagine being executed in your finest silk doublet. Talk about a bad last outfit choice. Historians still argue whether the baron's execution of Gaveston was a necessary act of enforcing the law against a dangerous outlaw or a cold-blooded murder and betrayal of a safe conduct, effectively an act of treason against the king's friend. Was it justice or revenge? The debate hinges on whether you view the ordinances as legitimate law and the barons as its enforcers, or as a partisan document used to justify eliminating a political opponent. Piers Gaveston was gone. The man who had caused so much strife, who had driven a wedge between the king and his nobility, was dead. You might think this would solve everything, bring peace and stability. But remember, this is medieval scandal. Removing one piece from the board rarely ends the game. It just changes who makes the next move. And Edward II, devastated by the death of his beloved Piers, was not about to forgive or forget this act by his barons. The conflict was far from over. Piers Gaveston is dead. Left on Blacklow Hill, his story brutally cut short by the very lords he had mocked. You might expect a moment of quiet reflection, perhaps a collective sigh of relief from the nobility that the disruptive favorite was finally gone. But this wasn't an ending. It was just the violent conclusion to the first act of a much longer, more tragic play. The immediate aftermath of Gaveston's death was not peace, but a hardening of positions and a deepening of the conflict. Edward II was by all accounts utterly devastated by the loss of Piers. His grief was profound, and it quickly turned into a cold, burning rage. The barons, particularly Thomas of Lancaster, and Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, had not just killed his friend. They had publicly humiliated him and defied his authority in the most brutal way possible. Edward saw their actions not as enforcing the ordinances, but as murder and an unforgivable personal betrayal. From this moment on, his relationship with these leading barons was irrevocably poisoned. His primary motivation became not governing the kingdom, but seeking vengeance for peers. The killing of Gaveston also caused a significant split among the barons themselves. Remember Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, who had given Piers his word and safe conduct. He was furious. His honor had been publicly trashed by Lancaster and Warwick's actions. Pembroke and the other more moderate lords who had supported the ordinances, but believed in due process and upholding oaths, were alienated by the hardliners' brutality. They felt the extremists had gone too far, exceeding the bounds of law and honor. So you had the king consumed by vengeance, the hardline barons unrepentant and powerful, and the moderate barons caught in the middle distrusting both sides. The united front that had forced the ordinances shattered. A mainstream historical fact is that Gaveston's execution in 1312 plunged England into a period of near civil war and political deadlock that lasted for several years. Edward II couldn't effectively rule because he couldn't trust or work with his most powerful nobles, and they in turn couldn't impose their will or reforms on a king who saw them as murderers. Parliament met rarely, and when it did, sessions were tense and unproductive. The government effectively ground to a halt on crucial issues. It was like a company board meeting, where the CEO refuses to speak to half the board members, and the other half are arguing amongst themselves about who's more morally outraged. Nothing gets done, and the company or kingdom suffers. In this climate of intense mutual suspicion and animosity, the ordinances of 1311, those ambitious reforms designed to curb royal power, became largely ineffectual. Edward II routinely ignored them, and the divided barons lacked the unity and leverage to force him to comply. The reforms were still technically law, but without enforcement, they were just words on expensive parchment. The opportunity to establish a more accountable monarchy, however flawed that attempt might have been, was lost in the bitter feuding that followed Gaveston's death. The kingdom was left in a precarious state. The war with Scotland under Robert the Bruce was still ongoing, and increasingly going badly for England, partly because the king and his nobles were too busy fighting each other to focus on the external enemy. Remember that pressure on medieval kings to be warriors. Edward II was singularly failing at this, distracted by his personal grief and vendetta. You can imagine the frustration of ordinary people, perhaps struggling with taxes or raids, while their leaders were engaged in a deadly feud over a dead favorite. It makes you wonder about the smaller human aspects of this period of paralysis. A quirky tidbit: despite the high-level political chaos, medieval people still cared about things like fashion and appearances. Sumptuary laws, which attempted to regulate what people of different social classes could wear, were sometimes enacted reflecting a concern with maintaining social order and visible status distinctions. So while the lords were plotting treason and murder, someone might have been getting fined for wearing clothes that were too fancy for their station. Priorities, right? Historians still argue whether Edward II's subsequent reliance on new favorites and his continued political failures were primarily a consequence of his inherent weakness as a ruler, or if the trauma of Gaveston's death and the barons' blatant defiance made effective governance impossible for him. Was he a bad king from the start, or did the barons' actions break him politically? It's another one of those frustrating historical puzzles where cause and effect are tangled like poorly stored chainmail. For years after Gaveston's death, the English court was a viper's nest of grudges plots and simmering resentment. Attempts at reconciliation were made, ceremonies of formal forgiveness were held, but the underlying bitterness remained. Edward II never truly forgave the men who killed Piers, and they never fully trusted a king who had shown such poor judgment and relied on men outside their circle. This unstable foundation would define the next decade of Edward's reign and ultimately pave the way for the next major scandal that would rock the kingdom, one involving the king's own family. The stage is being subtly rearranged, and new players are starting to move into position. While Edward II was nursing his grief for Piers and plotting revenge against the barons, another figure in the English court was quietly, or perhaps not so quietly, growing increasingly unhappy. This is where we bring Queen Isabella into sharper focus. Remember, she married Edward II back in 1308, just a year after his accession, and right when the Gaveston drama was hitting its stride. She was barely a teenager when she arrived in England, the daughter of Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, a king who was anything but fair to his enemies, as we'll see later, and one of the most politically savvy and ruthless monarchs in Europe. Isabella wasn't just any princess. She came from a court steeped in high-stakes power politics. She was born into a world where monarchs were expected to be strong and decisive. Her marriage to Edward was a grand affair, a major diplomatic coup intended to secure peace between England and France. You can picture the lavish wedding ceremony, the exchange of gifts, the blending of two powerful dynasties. A mainstream historical fact is that Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France and Joan Fernvers of Navarre. Her lineage alone made her one of the most prominent women in Europe, and her marriage to Edward II was a significant political event. She arrived in England bringing valuable territories and a substantial dowry. She was a prize, a symbol of alliance. But the reality of her marriage was quickly overshadowed by the elephant, or rather, the Piers Gaveston, in the room. From the moment she arrived, Isabella was confronted with the king's all-consuming devotion to his favorite. Chroniclers reported that Edward lavished gifts meant for his bride on Gaveston, even allegedly giving Piers jewels from the wedding dowry. Gaveston himself was reportedly rude and dismissive towards the new queen. Imagine being a young bride in a foreign country full of expectations, only to find your new husband is completely obsessed with his best friend, who also happens to be a total jerk to you. It's like the worst medieval rom-com you can imagine, except nobody's laughing. Isabella, proud and intelligent, was deeply humiliated and isolated. She was the Queen of England, daughter of the King of France, yet she felt secondary to Gaveston. Her letters back home likely painted a picture of an unhappy court and a deeply unsatisfactory marriage. While the barons openly battled Gaveston, Isabella had to endure his presence and her husband's neglect in a more personal, confined space. She was living the consequences of the king's favoritism every single day. Even after Gaveston was gone, killed in that brutal fashion, we discussed things didn't exactly become a fairy tale for Isabella. Edward II, though rid of Piers, didn't suddenly become a model husband and king. He continued to rely on favorites, most notably the Despencer family father and son, who gradually gained an even more dominant and corrupting influence over him than Gaveston ever had. The political instability continued. The war in Scotland worsened, and Edward's perceived incompetence and disregard for his nobles, and seemingly his queen, persisted. Isabella found herself increasingly sidelined in court. She was a powerful figure by birth, and marriage expected to play a political role to be an intercessor and a symbol of stability. Instead, she was married to a man who seemed incapable of providing either, and whose new favorites, the dispensers, were just as arrogant and hostile as Gaveston, if not more so. The dispensers actively worked to limit Isabella's influence and control her access to the king, and even reportedly encroached on her lands and income. You can feel her frustration building over the years, the slow burn of resentment turning into something more dangerous. It makes you wonder about the small symbolic acts of defiance or expression that might have happened in that constrained environment. A quirky tidbit medieval queens often had their own considerable households filled with ladies-in-waiting chaplains, servants, and administrators. These households could become centers of influence and information networks. Isabella's household would have been a space where French and English cultures mingled and where news and gossip and plots could travel. Perhaps small acts of cultural preference, like favoring French styles of dress or entertaining French visitors, were subtle ways she maintained her identity and connections amidst the English political turmoil. Historians still argue whether Isabella's initial unhappiness was primarily due to Edward's relationship with Gaveston, the political chaos of his reign, or his later reliance on the dispensers. Or was it a combination of factors that built up over almost 2 decades of a difficult marriage and a failing monarchy? Was she a victim of circumstance, or did she possess a calculating ambition that was merely waiting for the right opportunity? It's hard to know her true feelings and motives, buried as they are under centuries of historical interpretation, much of it written by men who were often biased. By the 1320s, Isabella was no longer a young bride. She was a mature woman, a mother to several children, including the heir to the throne, and she had spent years observing the dysfunction of her husband's reign and suffering the indignity of his favorites. Her patience was wearing thin. Her alienation was deep. The stage was being set for her to stop being a passive observer and start becoming a player in her own right. And her journey would take her back to the land of her birth, where she would find the means and a key partner to take drastic action. So, England is stuck in this loop of political dysfunction. Edward II is still brooding over Piers Gaveston, still failing to govern effectively, and now increasingly under the sway of a new set of favorites, the dispensers. Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son, Hugh the Younger. These guys were, if anything, even more rapacious and arrogant than Piers, grabbing land and power with both hands and making enemies faster than Edward II could make bad decisions. The tension in the kingdom was like a tightly wound spring, coiled even tighter than during the Gaveston years. And while the king was focused on his new favorites and his old grudges, his Queen Isabella was becoming a force in her own right. Enter Roger Mortimer. Not the elder Roger Mortimer, who was a respected baron, but his nephew, Roger Mortimer the Younger. This guy was a powerful marcher lord, meaning his family held significant lands and influence along the volatile border between England and Wales. Life in the marches was rough and tumble, requiring toughness, ambition, and a willingness to use force. Mortimer had all of that in spades. He was formidable, charismatic, and deeply involved in the baronial opposition that flared up again, largely fueled by resentment towards the dispensers. The dispensers' greed sparked what's known as the Dispenser War. a brutal conflict that saw Mortimer and other lords briefly drive the Despensers into exile before the king rallied and crushed the baronial rebellion. Mortimer was captured by the king's forces. As a leading rebel against the king and his powerful favorites, his fate seemed sealed. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, a grim stone fortress where people tended to go in but not come out. For a while, it looked like his story might end quietly in a dank cell. But Roger Mortimer was not about to go quietly. A mainstream historical fact is that Roger Mortimer the Younger made a spectacular escape from the Tower of London on the night of August 1st, 1323. The details read like something out of an action movie. He reportedly drugged his guards during a feast, climbed down a rope ladder that had been smuggled to him, and escaped across the Thames River under the cover of darkness. Imagine the sheer audacity slipping out of one of the most secure prisons in the kingdom, dangling from a rope. It's the kind of escape that makes you think, okay, this guy is serious. Having escaped certain death or lifelong imprisonment, Mortimer fled England and made his way to France. He was now an exile, but a dangerous one, nursing a burning grievance against Edward II and the Despensers. He connected with other English exiles and dissidents in France, creating a ready-made network of opposition just across the Channel. Meanwhile, back in England, things were getting worse for Isabella. The Despensers, particularly Hugh the Younger, had become incredibly powerful, effectively controlling access to the king and enriching themselves at everyone else's expense, including the Queen's. Isabella was increasingly desperate to escape their influence and the suffocating atmosphere of Edward's court. An opportunity arose in 1325. There was a long-running dispute between the English and French crowns over the Duchy of Aquitaine-Gascony, the English territory in France. Edward II, afraid to go to France himself for fear of being ambushed by French or English enemies, a valid fear given his track record, sent his wife Queen Isabella to negotiate with her brother, the new French king Charles IV. This was her chance. So you see Queen Isabella arriving in France, back in the sophisticated court of her birth, away from the problems of England. She's there, ostensibly, on a diplomatic mission, and she proves surprisingly adept at it, securing a seemingly favorable agreement. But while she was there, she connected with the exiled Roger Mortimer. How they initially met isn't precisely documented, but they certainly had mutual friends and shared enemies, Edward II and the Despensers. Their connection quickly went beyond political alliance. They became lovers. This was a major development. The Queen of England married to the king, entering into a relationship with his most dangerous exiled enemy. You can only imagine the clandestine meetings, the shared grievances turning into mutual attraction, the thrill of a forbidden romance layered over high-stakes political plotting. A quirky tidbit: Isabella was known for her beauty, often being called Isabella the Fair in chronicles. Mortimer was a rugged, experienced warrior and lord. Their pairing would have seemed both scandalous and potentially formidable to contemporaries. It's like a medieval political thriller suddenly gained a steamy romance subplot. Historians still argue about the exact timeline and nature of Isabella and Mortimer's relationship. Did it start purely as a political alliance that developed into romance? Or was there an immediate personal connection that fueled their political plotting? Was it a genuine love affair, a pragmatic partnership, or a bit of both? The lines between personal desire and political necessity were undoubtedly blurred in this era, especially for someone like Isabella, whose personal life had been so intertwined with political disappointment. Regardless of the precise origin of their feelings, the alliance between Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer was explosive. They were two powerful figures, both deeply wronged by Edward II and the Despensers, united by a shared enemy and a shared desire for power, and perhaps genuine affection. In France, they found a base of support among English exiles, and crucially the passive or active support of Isabella's brother, the King of France, who was no fan of Edward II. The plotting began in earnest. They weren't just seeking refuge anymore. They were planning a return to England, not as individuals, but as leaders of an invasion. The comfortable life in exile was over. It was time to plan the ultimate hostile takeover. So there you have them in France. Queen Isabella, daughter of the French king, estranged from her English husband and his loathed favorites, and Roger Mortimer, the daring escapee from the Tower, nursing his own grievances and ambitions. They are a potent combination, united by shared enemies, and as we discussed, a burgeoning romantic connection. But they weren't content to just live out their days as glamorous exiles in the French court. Oh no. They had bigger plans. Their goal rapidly evolved from simply removing the Despensers to something far more drastic, overthrowing Edward II himself and placing his young son, the future Edward III, on the throne. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was high treason punishable by the most brutal means the medieval mind could conjure. Planning a full-blown invasion of a kingdom isn't something you do over a casual brunch. It requires moneymen and allies. And from their base in France, Isabella and Mortimer began putting the pieces together. They became the rallying point for other English exiles, knights and lords who had fled Edward II's increasingly tyrannical rule and the Despensers' rapacity. These exiles provided a core group of loyal followers, men with swords experience, and their own reasons to want Edward and his favorites gone. It was a bit like forming a medieval supergroup of the politically dispossessed. Securing funds was critical. Invasions are expensive. Isabella likely used her own resources, perhaps jewelry or lands she still controlled or could mortgage. Mortimer, despite being in exile, probably still had contacts and ways to raise money. But they also needed external support. This is where Isabella's royal connections came into play. While her brother, Charles IV, King of France, couldn't officially fund an invasion of his brother-in-law's kingdom, that would look terrible diplomatically, even for a medieval king, he offered tacit support. He provided Isabella with protection and allowed her activities to continue, effectively turning a blind eye. More active support came from other continental rulers who had beefs with Edward II or saw an opportunity in his downfall. Most notably, they secured crucial aid and ships from William I, Count of Hainaut, modern-day Belgium, Netherlands, whose daughter Philippa was eventually betrothed to Isabella's son, young Edward, providing a strategic alliance and much-needed financial and naval resources. It's like getting venture capital for your regime change startup. They had to carefully manage the optics. Isabella, as queen, couldn't be seen openly plotting against her husband without losing legitimacy. Her public stance was that she was merely trying to free the king from the evil influence of the Despensers and restore good governance to England. The goal was to present their arrival not as an invasion against the king, but as a liberation for the king and the kingdom, freeing him from evil counselors. Roger Mortimer, of course, was just her loyal supporter, helping the distressed queen. Yeah, right. They plotted their route-debated landing sites and strategized how to rally support upon their arrival in England. They knew that Edward VI and the Despensers would be expecting them, or at least expecting someone. Edward's spies were active, trying to uncover Isabella's plans. The risk was immense. If they failed, the penalty for Mortimer was obvious: a traitor's death. For Isabella, as a queen and sister of the French king, it might have been imprisonment, but her son's future and her own life would be in grave peril. The stakes couldn't have been higher. You can almost feel the knot of tension in your stomach as they pore over maps in dimly lit rooms. A mainstream historical fact is that Isabella and Mortimer secured significant financial and military support from William the Recount of Hainaut, partly solidified by the agreement to marry young Edward to the Count's daughter Philippa. This alliance was crucial for providing the ships and initial troops needed for the invasion force. It shows how intertwined dynastic marriages and military campaigns were in medieval politics. It makes you wonder about the smaller human interactions during this intense planning phase. A quirky tidbit: while Isabella and Mortimer were plotting revolution, Isabella's young son, Edward the future king, was with them in France. He was presumably aware that something significant was afoot, traveling with his mother, and Mortimer being presented to foreign courts. Imagine being a kid, caught in the middle of your parents' very public, very dangerous separation, and your mom plotting to overthrow your dad with her boyfriend. Talk about a complicated childhood. Historians still argue about the extent to which Isabella was the driving force behind the invasion, or if she was primarily a pawn or figurehead used by Roger Mortimer to give his rebellion legitimacy. Was she a cunning political operator, orchestrating events, or a woman driven by desperation and relying on Mortimer's guidance? The truth is likely somewhere in between. She had the royal status and the French connections, while Mortimer had the military and political cunning necessary to execute the plan. They were a formidable, if unconventional, partnership. The preparations continued through 1326. Ships were gathered, troops were recruited, and messages were secretly sent to allies within England, gauging support and coordinating timing. Edward II and the Despensers grew increasingly aware that something was coming, but they weren't precisely sure when or where Isabella and Mortimer would strike. The waiting game was almost over. The exiles were ready to become invaders, setting sail for England to confront the king and reclaim the kingdom they believed had been misgoverned for too long. The Channel waters are looking ominous now. The planning was complete. Ships were gathered, mercenaries hired, and allies within England were waiting. In September 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, along with young Prince Edward and their relatively small invasion force, numbering maybe only a couple of thousand men initially, set sail across the English Channel. Imagine that crossing. The choppy waters, the fear and anticipation mingling in the salt air. Landing in England under arms against the reigning king. This was beyond rebellion. This was revolution. They landed at Orwell on the Suffolk coast on September 24th, 1326. And what happened next surprised almost everyone. Instead of facing fierce resistance from loyalist forces, they were met with, well, basically, open arms. The years of Edward II's disastrous rule, his obsession with favorites, the corruption and cruelty of the Despensers, it had all taken its toll. Support for the king had evaporated. The barons' knights, and even ordinary people who were fed up with the misgovernance, rallied to Isabella and Mortimer. The small invasion force quickly swelled as local levies and disaffected lords joined their banner. It was less an invasion and more like the kingdom collectively deciding, yeah, we're done with this guy. News of Isabella's landing and the surge of support reached Edward II and the Despensers, who were caught completely off guard. Their panic was immediate and palpable. You can almost hear the frantic shouting in the palace, the hurried packing, the thundering hooves as they fled. London, a city that had suffered under the Despensers' heavy hand, rose up in revolt as soon as the king departed, declaring for Isabella. The writing was on the wall, literally and figuratively, as crowds tore down Despenser property and seized the Tower of London. Edward II, accompanied by Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father Hugh the Elder, who was over 90 years old, by the way. Imagine being that age and still mixed up in this level of high-stakes drama, fled west, hoping to reach the relative safety of Wales, where the Despensers had vast lands and castles. They were pursued by Isabella and Mortimer's growing army, a chase across the heart of England. It was a humiliating flight for a king who had once seemed untouchable. The Despensers, the architects of so much of the recent misery, were the primary targets. Hugh Despenser, the elder, was captured first near Bristol, where he had gone to try and hold out in the town or nearby. His fate was swift and brutal. A mainstream historical fact is that Hugh Despenser the Elder was tried summarily and executed as a traitor in Bristol on November 17, 1326. Given his age, you might expect some leniency. Nope. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a truly horrific punishment reserved for treason, a gruesome spectacle designed to send a message. Imagine being 90, and that's how you go out. Just, wow. Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger managed to evade capture for a little longer, desperately moving around South Wales, trying to find a ship to escape or a castle to defend. But their luck had run out. Betrayed or discovered, they were eventually captured near Llantrisant in South Wales later that same month. The king and his favorite, huddled together in hiding, were found and taken into custody. You see Hugh Despenser the Younger, brought before Isabella and Mortimer, his face probably pale with terror, knowing his fate. His father's gruesome end was just a preview. Hugh the Younger was taken to Hereford and subjected to an equally, if not more horrific, public execution. A quirky tidbit chroniclers describe some particularly nasty details of Hugh the Younger's execution, including being dragged by horses, hanged castrated, and his body then quartered. It seems the public hatred for him was so intense that merely hanging wasn't considered sufficient. It was a grisly, vengeful spectacle, the culmination of years of resentment exploding in a horrifying display of medieval justice, or vengeance. Historians still argue whether the speed and ease of Isabella and Mortimer's invasion were primarily due to their effective planning and alliances, or simply the overwhelming unpopularity and incompetence of Edward II and the Despensers, meaning the regime was destined to collapse no matter who challenged it. Did Isabella and Mortimer win because they were strong, or because Edward's rule was inherently weak? It's a classic case of trying to weigh the impact of agency versus circumstance. With the Despensers dead in the most public and brutal fashion imaginable, and the king himself a captive, Isabella and Mortimer held all the cards. The invasion had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But capturing the king was one thing. Deciding what to do with him and legitimizing their takeover was another challenge entirely. The stage was set for the final act of Edward II's reign, and it would be as dramatic and controversial as everything that had come before. With the hated dispensers dead and the king a prisoner, Isabella and Mortimer were the undisputed masters of England. You've witnessed the swift collapse of Edward II's regime and the brutal fate of his favorites. But holding a captive king is a tricky business. What do you do with him? Simply killing him or declaring him deposed outright was politically dangerous. While medieval history wasn't short on kings meeting sticky ends, a formal, unchallengeable deposition was rare in England and could set a problematic precedent, potentially undermining the very principle of hereditary kingship that the new regime would rely upon for young Edward III. So Isabella and Mortimer, along with their supporters, devised a plan that was both innovative and ruthless. They would force Edward II to abdicate voluntarily in favor of his son. This way, the succession would pass legitimately to the rightful heir, preserving the appearance of continuity and avoiding the messiness of deposing an anointed king. It was politically savvy, if utterly Machiavellian. They weren't overthrowing the monarchy, they were just facilitating an early retirement for the current monarch. The process was formalized through a parliament convened in January 1327. Parliaments were theoretically bodies that represented the realm, and getting parliamentary assent would provide a veneer of legitimacy for the drastic action they were about to take. This parliament effectively put Edward II on trial in absentia. Accusations of misrule and incompetence, allowing himself to be governed by evil counselors and failing to recover Scotland, were leveled against him. The narrative carefully constructed was that Edward II was not just a bad king, but an unfit king, incapable of fulfilling his duties. A mainstream historical fact is that the Parliament of January 1327 declared Edward II unfit to rule and chose his son Edward III as king. This was a pivotal moment, effectively legitimizing the transfer of power initiated by Isabella and Mortimer. While framed as a choice by the realm, it was made under the clear political and military dominance of the invading forces. Once the Parliament had made its declaration, a delegation of lords, bishops, and representatives of the Commons was sent to Kenilworth Castle, where Edward was initially held, to inform him of Parliament's decision and to receive his abdication. Imagine that journey. The solemn faces of the delegates riding towards a castle, holding the king they were about to force off his throne. You accompany them, feeling the weight of history in every hoofbeat. They entered Edward's presence in the castle. What happened next was a mix of formal pronouncements, accusations, and immense psychological pressure. The delegates laid out the Parliament's case against him, detailing his alleged failures and explaining that the kingdom had chosen his son as king. They weren't asking him, they were telling him. They presented him with two options, neither of them good. Either abdicate willingly, or they would renounce their homage to him entirely, potentially opening the door for someone outside his family line to claim the throne. A veiled threat, perhaps suggesting Isabella or Mortimer themselves, though unlikely. Edward II was isolated and powerless. His supporters were dead or scattered. The kingdom had declared against him. He was confronted by the united will of the new regime. Chroniclers describe Edward's emotional reaction, weeping, lamenting his fate, expressing sorrow that his people had turned against him. Despite his weaknesses as a king, he was still a man facing the utter collapse of his world. You witness his tears, the raw human emotion beneath the weight of the crown he was about to lose. Ultimately, he had no real choice. Under duress, facing threats, and with no hope of rescue, Edward II formally agreed to abdicate his throne in favor of his son. One of the bishops present often reported as Bishop Orleton, a man who had actively supported Isabella and Mortimer, dramatically renounced his homage to Edward on behalf of the realm, symbolizing the transfer of loyalty to the new king. It makes you wonder about the smaller, more personal details of Edward's captivity. A quirky tidbit: while being held captive, Edward II reportedly suffered various indignities, including being mocked and even having lukewarm water from a ditch used for his shaving rather than hot water. Small cruelties designed to break his spirit and emphasize his fall from grace. Imagine being used to the finest comforts and suddenly having to shave with ditch water. A truly rough start to your forced retirement. Historians still argue about the precise dynamics of the abdication scene. Was Edward II genuinely broken and resigned? Or was he acting hoping to buy time or sympathy? Were the threats explicit or implied? The accounts are colored by the perspectives of the chroniclers who were writing after the fact and often had their own biases regarding Isabella Mortimer and Edward II. It's like trying to piece together a conversation from fragmented eavesdropping. You get the gist, but the nuances are lost. With the abdication secured, young Edward III was formally proclaimed king. A regency council was established to rule in his name, but everyone knew who held the real power: Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer. They had successfully overthrown a king and installed themselves as the de facto rulers of England. But their power was built on a foundation of political maneuverings and a forced abdication, with a living former king still a potential threat. The question of Edward II's ultimate fate still loomed large, a dark cloud hanging over their triumph. So you've seen the dramatic fall of Edward II and the rise of Isabella and Mortimer in England. The dust is starting to settle on that particular royal upheaval, though the fate of the deposed king remains a tense question mark. But while England was grappling with captive monarchs and executed favorites across the English Channel in the Kingdom of France, the very place where Isabella found refuge and plotted her return, ruled by her formidable father Philip IV. Another equally explosive scandal was reaching its climax. This one didn't involve a king's favorite or a queen's lover, but a legendary, powerful, and mysterious religious military order, the Knights Templar. Imagine a group of warrior monks, dedicated to God, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet also formidable fighters, clad in distinctive white mantles with a red cross. This was the original vision of the Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century during the era of the Crusades. Their initial purpose was to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. You can picture them, a small band of knights guarding the dusty, dangerous roads, living a life of pious austerity combined with military duty. But over the next 2 centuries, the Order of the Knights Templar evolved dramatically. Thanks to generous donations of land, money, and property from grateful pilgrims and powerful patrons across Europe, they became incredibly wealthy. Their initial network of safe houses for pilgrims grew into a vast international infrastructure of castles, farms, chapels, and financial centers known as preceptories. They were exempt from local laws and taxes, answerable only to the Pope himself. This autonomy, combined with their wealth and military organization, made them a unique power player in medieval Europe. They didn't just guard roads. They fought in the Crusades, becoming some of the most dedicated and effective warriors in the Holy Land. But perhaps their most significant and ultimately fateful development was in the realm of finance. The Templars became the bankers of Europe. People going on crusade or needing to transfer large sums of money could deposit funds in a Templar preceptory in one country and withdraw them from another using letters of credit, essentially an early form of traveler's checks. They lent money to kings, nobles, and merchants accumulating vast fortunes and assets. A mainstream historical fact is that the Knights Templar developed a sophisticated financial system, effectively acting as international bankers and treasurers for various European monarchs, including the King of France. Their wealth was immense, and their operations were shrouded in a certain degree of secrecy, as befitted a monastic order with arcane rituals. They held their chapter meetings in private, and admission to the order involved secret ceremonies. This combination of immense power, vast wealth, international reach, and secrecy began to breed suspicion and envy. Kings owed them money. Nobles resented their privileges and autonomy. The church hierarchy sometimes viewed their direct link to the Pope with unease. They were everywhere involved in everything, and yet slightly apart, a powerful, self-contained entity in a world based on clear hierarchies and loyalties. You can almost feel the weight of their accumulated gold, the silent power of their network stretching across borders. It makes you wonder what kind of quirky practices were part of their daily monastic military routine. A quirky tidbit. While they were fearsome warriors and shrewd financiers, the Templars, as a monastic order, had rules governing even mundane things like their beards. Their rule stipulated that brothers should wear beards as a sign of their piety and commitment, setting them apart from fashionable clean-shaven laymen. So, these powerful international bankers and warriors were all sporting very devout regulation beards. Imagine trying to negotiate a loan with a committee of stern, bearded warrior monks, intimidating their independence and wealth, while a source of their strength also made them vulnerable. Kings, always in need of money, might look enviously at the Templars' overflowing coffers. Those who owed them money might prefer to see the order disappear rather than pay up. And their power made them a potential threat to anyone who wanted absolute authority within their own realm. You can almost hear the whispers starting questions about what really went on behind the closed doors of their chapter houses, fueled by a mix of fear, greed, and misunderstanding. Historians still argue about the true extent of the Templars' wealth and influence. Were they truly the richest and most powerful organization in Europe? Or were the legends exaggerated by those who sought to destroy them? Was their financial power wielded responsibly, or did it make them arrogant and overconfident? The reality is probably somewhere in between the popular myths and the harsh accusations leveled against them. But their perceived wealth was certainly a major factor in their downfall. They had castles, armies, banks, and friends in high places. But they also had something else: enemies. Powerful enemies who saw their wealth as a prize to be seized and their autonomy as a challenge to be crushed. And the most powerful of these enemies was about to set his sights squarely on the order. This takes us back to France and to the father of Queen Isabella, King Philip IV. The storm clouds are gathering over the white mantles and red crosses. So you've just had a whirlwind tour of English royal dysfunction. The king and his favorite, the queen, and her lover taking over. But across the water, in the kingdom of France, where Queen Isabella's formidable father, Philip IV, sat on the throne, a different kind of storm was brewing aimed squarely at those powerful, wealthy bearded warrior monks, the Knights Templar. While the English court was consumed by its internal feuds, Philip IV was quietly laying plans that would send shockwaves across Christendom. Philip IV was, as we mentioned, Isabella's dad, and he was a king who wanted power and, crucially, money. Running a kingdom like France with its wars and growing bureaucracy was expensive. Philip was constantly in debt, and guess who was one of his major creditors? Yep, the Knights Templar. They had lent him significant sums and probably held assets for him too. Envy of their vast wealth coupled with the king's desperate need for funds certainly provided a powerful motive. Why pay back a huge debt when you could just seize the assets? But it wasn't just about money, though. That was a huge driver. Philip was also a king, obsessed with consolidating his power and the authority of the French state. The Templars, with their international organization, their wealth, and their unique position, answerable only to the Pope, represented a significant semi-independent power structure within his kingdom. They were a state within a state, and that challenged Philip's vision of absolute monarchy. Add to this a fervent, though perhaps twisted piety. Philip saw himself as God's instrument on earth. And you have a king who could rationalize destroying the order as both financially expedient and morally justified. He likely genuinely believed the Templars were corrupt or even heretical, especially if they weren't fully aligned with his own agenda. Philip worked in almost complete secrecy, a testament to his meticulous and ruthless planning. He used his loyal officials and legal experts, many of whom were known for their harsh tactics, to build a case against the order, based on rumors and possibly information from disgruntled former members or those who envied the Templars. He wasn't just going to arrest a few. He was going to try and take down the entire order in one swift, coordinated blow. You can picture the clandestine meetings in the king's inner chambers, the hushed voices, the maps spread out, planning the simultaneous arrests across the vastness of France. The day chosen for the operation has gone down in history. A mainstream historical fact is that on Friday, October 13th, in 1307, Philip IV's agents carried out mass arrests of Knights Templar throughout France. Thousands of Templars, from the highest ranks to the humblest sergeants, were rounded up, simultaneously caught completely by surprise. Their preceptories were seized, their assets confiscated. This is arguably the origin of the superstition around Friday the 13th being unlucky. For the Templars in France, it certainly was. The accusations leveled against them were shocking and designed to instantly discredit the order in the eyes of a devout medieval public. They were accused of heresy of denying Christ and spitting on the cross during their secret initiation ceremonies, of worshiping an idol or a head called Baphomet, of engaging in sodomy, and of various other offenses, including financial corruption. These were the kinds of charges that would make even their staunchest supporters recoil in horror. Imagine being accused of spitting on the cross in the 14th century. That was about as bad as it got. Philip's agents used torture extensively and brutally to extract confessions, twisting bodies and minds until individuals, even high-ranking Templars, admitted to whatever was put before them, desperate for the pain to stop. These confessions, however, coerced, were then used as proof of the order's alleged depravity. It was a horrifyingly effective strategy of smear and destruction. A quirky tidbit: some of the alleged confessions mention kissing rituals in unusual places during their secret ceremonies, details that fueled the public imagination. and added to the air of scandalous perversion surrounding the order. It's like medieval tabloid fodder, but with rack and thumbscrews involved. Historians still argue whether any of the accusations against the Templars had any basis in truth, or if they were entirely fabricated by Philip IV and his agents to justify his attack. Were there genuinely unorthodox practices or beliefs within the order? Perhaps deviations from mainstream doctrine developed over centuries of operating in the unique environment of the Crusades? Or was it all a complete fabrication driven by greed and political ambition? The lack of objective evidence outside of torture-induced confessions makes it incredibly difficult to definitively say. The arrests of October 1307 marked the beginning of the end for the Knights Templar. It wasn't a swift conclusion. The process of Trial's papal investigation and the order's eventual dissolution would drag on for several years. But the blow was fatal. Philip IV had struck at the heart of this powerful independent organization, seizing its wealth and destroying its reputation. The persecution of the Templars stands as one of the most dramatic and controversial episodes of medieval history, a stark reminder of how even the most powerful institutions could fall victim to a king's determination debt and the chilling effectiveness of propaganda and torture. The white mantles are stained now, and the air feels cold and uncertain. As our journey through these medieval scandals draws to a close, feel the tension of those times begin to soften. The echoes of political intrigue, the clash of ambition and power, the whispers of conspiracy. They start to fade like the last embers of a fire. The grand stone castles, once alive with drama and danger, are now just quiet shapes against the night sky. The figures we've met, the kings, the favorites, the queens, the knights, they recede into the tapestry of history, their struggles finished. Allow the sounds of these distant events to gently quieten in your mind. The rustle of ancient robes, the clinking of medieval coins, the harsh scrape of a quill on parchment, the distant sound of the sea. Let them become soft murmurs, then silence. There's nothing more to fear from these long-ago scandals. Their consequences played out centuries ago. You are safe here, in the quiet of your own space, in the comfort of the present. Breathe slowly now, feeling the air fill your lungs, then release it, letting go of any lingering traces of this turbulent past. The world of medieval courts and conspiracies is far away. All that tension, all that drama is settling down, leaving only the calm and stillness of the night. Feel yourself growing heavy, drifting. The stories are over now. Just peace and quiet remain. Sweet dreams.